Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Maureen Haker, and I'm going to be doing this session on data in the spotlight, qualitative and mixed methods data. So as the name would suggest, I'm going to go through some of the collections that we hold that are qualitative and mixed methods. It is an introductory webinar, so if you have very little prior knowledge about the UK Data Service or just archiving in general, and all of the delights that we hold within our archive, this is just right for you. So I've worked with the UK Data Service for over 10 years now in various roles um, for everything from ingesting new collections through digitizing through to actual reuse projects. So I'm going to share with you along the way some of the things that I particularly love about the archive. And here's an overview of what we're going to cover today. So I just want to say a little bit about the broader picture of the UK Data Service so you know where qualitative and mixed methods data kind of fit within the bigger picture. I'll give some examples and details of our best qualitative and mixed data collections, and I'll try and show you how they've been used in some quite creative ways. I'll also cover how to find and access data, particularly the qualitative and mixed data. We have a couple of special tools that you can use. And then I'm going to close with some tips and resources and places to go if you need further help. Do be aware we've got online workshops that cover a lot of different topics that I'm going to cover today, but in much greater detail. So if you're looking for more information on, for example, finding and accessing data, we do have online tutorials, and we do offer other workshops that might cover that in more detail. This is just meant to be a quick overview. We've kind of found that people want some information on those sorts of things, even when the primary topic is to cover the data itself. Okay, so what is the UK Data Service? We are a comprehensive resource that is funded by the ESRC. Our main job is to be a single point of access to a wide range of secondary social science data. The main purpose then is the collection and the ingest and processing of data, and then further dissemination of that data for people to use. In addition to that infrastructure core, we also have a service layer, which provides extensive support, training, and guidance, much like these online workshops that we offer. Who is it for? We like to think that it's for anyone who has an interest in data. Traditionally, our main audience and the people who probably both deposit and use our data the most tend to be academic researchers and students. A lot of other groups are well represented as well, including government analysts, charities, foundations, businesses, research centers, and think tanks. All will give us and use our data. Given the importance of data and how it's used and how it's disseminated, we're trying to reach out and support a wide range of communities. Here is the front page for our website, which some of you may have already seen when you registered for the workshop. This is just the kind of top half of the page to give you a flavor of what we do. And the link to see that is just there at the top. We do have, if you look into the Learning Hub, if you haven't explored that tab yet, we do have quite a lot of pages. I think somebody once told me we had over 2,000 pages of information related to things like the research data cycle, data management, ethics and research. So if you're conducting your own research, or just kind of looking for more information about data and data infrastructure, check out our Learning Hub. And then, of course, we're going to look under the Find Data tab a little bit later when we talk about accessing data. What kind of data do we hold? This session is about qualitative and mixed methods data, but just so you know, the majority of our data, at least judging by the number of collections, is quantitative data. So we hold over 10,000 collections, of which 8,000 of them are quantitative collections. And we do hold a wide variety of that data. So we have survey data, both cross-sectional and longitudinal, as well as cross-national. We have aggregate statistics, both domestic and international macro data. We do hold some census data as well, so it's aggregate 471 to 2011, and microdata for some select years as well. We also have some newer forms of data, like synthetic data. So that's a small collection. I think we have about 10 data sets that are synthetic at the moment, but that's a new area where you might see some more. We also have some very challenging and difficult kind of data, like geospatial data, where it's potentially disclosive. Um, Today, of course, I'm going to be focusing on our qualitative and mixed methods data. So where does it come from? Again, that varies depending on the data type and some of the sources that you see here, including agencies and statistical time series. Those are clearly the main sources for quantitative data. Most of our qualitative and mixed methods data comes through individual academics, and many of those have been funded by research grants. So this is often funded by a research council like the ESRC, but not exclusively. We certainly take in data from other funders. So we hold data that's been funded by the Wellcome Trust and Leverhulme and others. We also have independently funded work as well. And then, of course, for some of the qualitative, originally paper-based materials, we also hold those public records and historical sources. Where it's possible to digitize and enhance those collections, we've done so. Um, so if you wanted a quick way to see data that was based on a theme, we do have a listing for this. So you simply click Find Data at the top of the home page. And then if you kind of scroll down a little bit, you're going to see these boxes. And this area collates a selection of very high quality data, specifically covering these themes. And it includes a range of different data types. So there are qualitative examples that are included within those themes as well. And just below the Browse by Theme, we also have some signposting to other data resources like Nestar and teaching data sets. I'm going to talk about QualiBank a little bit later on. And then we also have some signposting to other data catalogs like the CESDA catalog. So CESDA is the Consortium for European Social Science Data Archives. So that brings you to a data catalog that kind of collates the entries for data archives across Europe. And we also have ICPSR data catalog. So that's kind of our North American counterparts. So it's worth kind of exploring some of those other data resources if you're interested. Okay, so let me talk to you a little bit about the qualitative collections that we hold. That gives you a sense of the kind of range of data that we have. So the first study here, I think demonstrates the quality and capacity in inclusive research with people with learning disabilities. So this is focus group based research. And some of the focus groups are with people who have learning disabilities. And some of the focus groups are with researchers who themselves have a learning disability and are doing research on learning disabilities. So this is very much in the spirit of active research, of participatory research. And then, of course, it's just a really good example of focus group research. Just note here as well that data reuse is a great way to access certain populations which would normally be very difficult to access, either because they're physically difficult to access. So this might be, for example, prisoners, or in the case of disability, sometimes it just requires further resources to appropriately safeguard and address the needs of the group. So that might pose some, quite practical funding or ethical challenges. But we have a number of collections that kind of access these participants for you. So data reuse is a great way to kind of explore some of those more vulnerable groups. Okay, so the second item here, Intergenerational Dynamics, is by Jennifer Mason, and it looks at whether people above the age of 50 consider themselves a generation, and whether or not they identify as a generation in contrast to other age groups, primarily younger groups. But do they identify themselves a bit differently? And she's done a great deal of work on these kinds of aging and generational dynamics. And this is an interview-based data set. And again, it's very high quality. The next one is chronic illness and online networking. expectations, assumptions, and everyday realities. So this is research on diabetes and the use of Facebook. So just the point to make here about this particular one, we don't, it's very difficult, I should say, to take in data that's kind of what was once called the new and novel forms, like big data, social media data, those sorts of things. There's a lot of challenges, especially with some of the data protection legislation that we have and the way that platforms kind of safeguard the information that's available on their websites. But we do get some. And this is an example of someone who's been using Facebook contacts in order to study how people with diabetes form support groups and how they get information. So it's quite creative. It's a different kind of data from the usual kind of interview-based data. So it's another great example, I think, of the kinds of data that we can hold. Okay, the fourth one down is a coalitional presidentialism in comparative perspective, minority executives and multi-party systems. So it's quite a mouthful, and it's not quite as accessible as some of the others. There's some additional kind of access restrictions on it, and I will talk about access restrictions a little bit later. But I did want to make a particular point with this one, and that's that you don't just get individual-based data in qualitative and mixed methods data. So this study is looking at presidential coalitions across a number of countries, so across Europe and Africa and Asia. And it makes the point again that even with qualitative research, you can do macro scale kind of comparative work. And this kind of study is a good example of that. Okay, and the final one, family, life, and work experience before 1918. This is the founding collection for the qualitative part of our archive. So I would be amiss if I didn't mention this one. It's not new, and it certainly doesn't need publicity. It's a very, very well reused collection. It's comprised of over 400, I believe it's 453 oral history interviews, and it's widely considered to be the first oral history project of Britain. I just wanted to signpost to it as perhaps the typical kind of collection that many people would think of with qualitative data. So these are life history interviews, but this is a particularly large one, so 453, and this was conducted by Paul Thompson, who is an eminent oral historian. So anybody who's kind of familiar with his work knows that his oral histories, he can really get quite a lot of information out of people. And some of these interviews are well over 80 pages long. So it's quite a lot of data. Most of our collections are not going to be this large. But this one was done with people who were born during the Edwardian period. And it covers all aspects of people's lives. So it's an incredibly rich collection. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is give you a quick whirlwind of four collections that we hold here and just tell you a little bit about what they've done and how they've been used. So the first of these is The Last Refuge, and you'll notice I've put in the SN, which might seem a bit esoteric to you if you're new to the UK data service. But all of our collections have a study number that's associated with it. And you can find our collections through a lot of different tools. But if you do happen to run across a study number, it's a really quick way to find the collection. So that's kind of useful to know about. So The Last Refuge was conducted by Peter Townsend and is a major investigation of long-stay institutional care for old people in Britain in the late 1950s. And again, a bit like the family life and work experience before 1918, this study was really exceptional for its breadth and range, given the time that it was done. So this collection has in-depth interviews with 67 local authority chief welfare officers, and also with serving staff and residents of 173 institutions. It's also an important collection because of the diversity of content. So it wasn't just interviews. There were also photographs, field notes, and diaries that were collected. I think another feature that's quite important about this collection is that the diaries are recorded by both members of staff and residents of the institutions. And I think this is one of the few examples where there are actual voices of residents of long stay institutions. Um, so here you can see some of the richness of some of the images that are available with this data collection, which can really help you to kind of visualize more of the context of that collection. And the reason this collection is so influential is twofold. One is that it was a pioneering use of qualitative data in the area of old age, retirement, isolation, services, and so forth. So some quantitative work had been done, but really the use of qualitative data for this kind of direct policy relevance was new with Townsend's work. And the second reason was that this study had major policy implications because Townsend's results challenged whether long stay institutions were really the best place for the elderly. And I think part of the conclusion of the book is that for many elderly in some circumstances, they're not the right form of institution. But it also had practical implications in that he recognized that people needed not just criticism, but also suggestions. And he came up with recommended improvements that institutions could adapt. The next study I will tell you a little bit about is my absolute favorite study, and it's called the School Leavers Study. And in this case, the original data were collected in 1978 by a researcher named Ray Paul. Um, and this was work that was done with students on the Isle of Sheppey. So Sheppey is an island off of the east part of the UK. And Ray Paul had spent a long time studying a lot of different aspects of living and working on the Isle of Sheppey. So this included things like employment, education, religion, family. So there was a huge range of issues. And somewhere in that process, he got quite interested in schools and the educational experience. So he found out about a situation where teachers at one of the comprehensive schools were asked to set a particular kind of essay to pupils just before they were due to leave school. So this is roughly about 16 years old. And I think, this is a difficult kind of essay sometimes for children, but they were asked to imagine they were nearing the end of their life and something had made them think back to the time that they left school. And they then had to write an imaginary account of how their life played out after leaving school at 16. So we're looking at the 30 or 40 years following. So despite, being a bit of a difficult exercise to engage in, the students did an impressive job providing a lot of details, which allowed a quick glimpse into the kind of aspirations and expectations and the realities of some of their lives to come. So what we got from that exercise was 141 of these essays. So 89 boys and 52 girls provided essays. And you can see here, there's a lot more to be done with these essays, but I'm just highlighting a few key points. Is that there's a lot of themes of realism, possibly pessimism, but definitely realism within these essays. So young people talked about mundane but stable and grounded jobs. They imagined a very gradual career progression if they progressed at all. There were also stories of stagnation and unemployment. And somewhat morbidly, some predicted their own early death or the early death of someone they loved. And the quotes down at the bottom there, I think, give you a flavor of the tone. Again, not all of the essays would have had this, but there were strong themes throughout the data set. And it was very realistic, kind of very down to earth kind of commentary. So for example, you have the boy who said, "It was hard finding a job. I failed a few chances and eventually got what I wanted locally." Or the boy who said, "I was on the dole," so they were on welfare for 6 months after leaving school until I got a job in a garage. Or the girl at the bottom who said, "I longed for something exciting and challenging, but yet again I had to settle for second best. I began working in a large clothes factory." What's interesting, though, is that some contemporary researchers, so Graham Crowe and Don Lyon, in the year 2009, 2010, they reused this data. And what they did what's called a restudy, where they examined the existing data and then they did the exercise again. So it's not a strict replication because Paul more or less kind of stumbled upon the assignment that teachers had set their students. So he didn't have as much control over how the essay was put to students. But it's still a really useful reuse study. Graham Crowe took a lot of time to speak with Ray Paul about it and try and replicate it as well as he could. So we now have this new collection of data, which offers a comparative to the present day. So like the first collection, it asks school leavers on Sheppy to imagine their lives, but we get a very different story. So for Sheppy's young people, in 2010, we hear really different themes. So again, similar sort of sample size. We had 110 essays, bit more evenly split between boys and girls, and generally, quite broadly, the themes that arose from the present day Sheppy students, kind of match. They talked about family and leisure and employment. But they talked about it in very different ways. So the Sheppy students today imagined stories that were included well-paid and instantaneous jobs. They included things like signing a contract for football or singing. And there was a lot of choice in their lives, but also a lot of uncertainty. And we see a clear influence of celebrity culture. So again, you can get a feel for the restudy by looking at some of the quotes at the bottom there. So you have one boy who wrote that he had an amazing band and toured the world 3 times and sold 4 million records. And another thought he would own a 3-bedroom luxury villa, a helicopter, and a Bentley. And then finally, we have the girl at the bottom who wanted to be anything from a dancer, a hairdresser, a horse rider, and if a dancer, her dream would be to dance for Beyonce or someone really famous. So it's quite a shift in the possibilities for young people today. And in terms of the impact of this particular study, it's quite different from the last refuge. So as part of the restudy, Graham Crow and Don Lyon engaged with the community on the Isle of Sheppey and actively sought to involve them in the process of data creation and analysis. And as part of that initiative, they created the Living and Working on the Isle of Sheppey website, where they have an archive so the community members can see the original study as well as the data that's been added as part of the restudy. And they've given their community a kind of written and oral history while also engaging them and kind of exploring their community from different perspectives. So they have, for example, videos and art galleries and audio, so people can really experience the kind of lived memory of their community. So for the third study I want to look at, this one is actually a very well-known mixed methods study called the National Child Development Survey. And it follows the lives of over 17,000 people who were born in the same week of 1958. At this point, the people are surveyed every several years. So they've been surveyed about 10 times since the initial contact in 1958. So the first survey was done starting when just participants were 7 years old. And by that point, the information is, absolutely comprehensive. So it includes information about their physical development, their education, the economic circumstances of their parents and their family. It includes employment of their family, their own health, well-being, and social participation. So it's absolutely sweeping in terms of what's been included within the survey. So from the standpoint of quantitative data, this is a really, really good data set. But what makes it even better is that there's a qualitative addition to this fantastic collection, which allows for this very rich mixed methods work to be done. So in 1969, when the kids were aged 11, they had a very similar kind of essay that was asked of them that was basically the same as school leavers, slightly different. So children were asked to imagine they were only 25. So just, getting to the end of school basically and kind of starting employment. So starting off their adult lives. And just to write about what their lives are like at that point. So it's a little bit more realistic experience to kind of project about 15 years ahead. They got over 500 essays in the end. And of course, what's really valuable about this collection is twofold. One is that the sample size is large, particularly for a qualitative collection. And the second is that you have the quantitative data to compare what actually happened to them at age 25. So not only can you look at what they thought would happen, but then you can look at their lives at 25 and now also 45 and 55 and 65 and see how things kind of unfolded. And a number of articles have been written using this data collection. Jane Elliott, whose publication looking at gender on the right there, is one of the best known people to have used this particular data set. The last study I wanted to look at is the Qualitative Election Study of Britain. So the Qualitative Election Study of Britain is a long-running research program which is designed to capture how people in Britain kind of experience electoral politics. So unlike the traditional surveys that focus on these kind of quantifiable measures of opinion, the QESB uses in-depth interviews and focus groups conducted during and after general elections to explore some of the narratives and the reasoning and the kind of language that voters use when they're making political choices. And by foregrounding citizens' own voices, the study offers these really rich insights into the social meanings of elections. So, how campaign messages are received, how voters make sense of the kind of political changes that are going on. And because, of course, people's political opinions are not easily captured by a single statistics, people can hold contradicting views of a party. They can explain their own political views using stories or using frames around like morality and competence. These interviews and focus groups are a really rich kind of data source for exploring political identities. And those identities are often fluid and emotionally tied as well. So that's, it makes that qualitative study really valuable for understanding what drives voters. And what's really wonderful about this collection is the sheer number of resources that they hold. So on the page here is their website, the QESB.info, and that's where they have a blog, they have a listing of all their publications, they have related documentations for each of the waves that they've done. They have a wide range of data that includes video and audio, as well as transcripts, as well as handwritten handouts, and all of that is digitized. And from the start of the data collection, permission was sought for it to be shared, so you can access any of that data. And of course, the research team are really well published as well. So you can see a snippet of the different visualizations of party leaders on the left that they made. So the continuum is from the research team, but you'll notice there's also a doodle as well on the right of Nigel Farage, and that's courtesy of one of their focus group participants. So they've published on methodological developments that arise from their work, as well as findings on their analysis of the data, and they continue to collect data. So they've just published the 2024 data, and they are also one of our only series with qualitative data in it. So not only do you have this kind of rich data on political opinions, but it's also longitudinal. So Christy Winters and her team continue to collect data for it. It's really well documented, and it's conceived with a plan to share from the start. So if you do want to explore political identities and narratives, this is definitely a collection to have a look at. Okay, so hopefully by now I've persuaded you that using qualitative and mixed data is a great idea, and you want to get your hands on some of it. So let me now just go through how you can do that. And you can do that with our data catalog, which is aptly named. So this slide just kind of gives you a snippet of what it looks like to conduct a search using the filters on the left-hand side, which are adjusted for qualitative collections only. So when you click on Find Data at the tab at the top of our website, it'll bring you directly to our data catalog, and you can just see this kind of really tempting search bar where you can begin your search. So you just type in some keywords, click on search, and then you can use the left-hand menus to filter your search. So here I've entered a search term of food, and then I've filtered by qualitative data, which has brought me back 121 studies. So the term food could be anywhere in the abstract, the title, the keywords, or the subjects. It can be anywhere in the catalog record, and it'll bring it back as part of the search results. Now, it's worth noting here that I am currently in the Reshare tab. We do have two parts to our archive. So Reshare is our self-deposit system. So this is where researchers themselves have cleaned and prepared the data, and then we do some checks on it and publish it. But we also have another part of our archive, which is where we play a greater role in curating that data. So this is usually data that's been, for example, collected by government agencies, or it's particularly large or nationally representative, kind of, or longitudinal surveys, those sorts of things. So you should check both tabs to see what comes up. But our data catalog does use those tabs to distinguish between what we've had a role in curating and what just the research team has curated. So that's how our data catalog works. We do have further video tutorials and web pages that explain a little bit more about the data catalog and how to use it, but this just gives you an idea of how to get started. And it is as easy as just kind of typing in some keywords and playing around with the filters. Just make sure you check both the Studies tab and the Reshare Studies tab at the top of the page. We do also have a unique way to search for qualitative material specifically, and that is QualiBank. And this is an online resource that allows you to search, browse, and cite qualitative materials. So you can get to it by just clicking on QualiBank. So you'll find underneath the search button tab on our data catalog, there's a word QualiBank there. You can click on that. You can also just add a / QualiBank to our web page, to our URL. And QualiBank is a great tool because it addresses three key issues that arise when you're reusing qualitative and mixed methods data. So I'm going to explain a little bit more of those issues as we go along. But in short, these things are finding data, recontextualizing the data, and citing the data. So if you want to search using QualiBank, it works in the same way as the data catalog. And here you can see I've tried typing in typhoid. And again, you can see like the data catalog, I've got 20 results. So what's different about how the QualiBank searches, however, is that it actually searches through the data itself. So if you're looking for qualitative data that specifically has a keyword or concept in it, you can use QualiBank to search through the data itself rather than just the catalog record. And this is really a key issue in reusing qualitative data. How do you find the right data for your project? And the nature of qualitative data is such that it's really rich, it's in-depth, it's detailed, and could potentially answer a lot of different research questions beyond the ones that the original investigators chose. So taking that time to familiarize yourself with the data can be really time consuming if you're searching on a topic that returns a number of collections. So QualiBank helps resolve this by searching through the data itself. So hopefully you get a better idea of whether or not that data is right for your project. So right now, QualiBank has about 50 collections that are uploaded into its database. This is something that we're looking to expand. It's kind of a bit of a process really to ingest into QualiBank. You can also browse through that data. So if you know what collections you want to look through, or if you have certain criteria for a participant's age, gender, social class, or region, you can refine those characteristics using the left-hand menu. So where in the data catalog, the left-hand menu will help you filter the data collections. In QualiBank, the left-hand menu is going to help you filter the participants themselves, if that makes sense. Okay, so once you have, it's just probably worth noting, once you have selected some filters on the left-hand side, you will need to hit refine. Otherwise, it won't take those into account. So I think with the depending on what you're ticking on in the data catalog, it will automatically start refining the search. In QualiBank, you have to actually hit refine for those searching facets to take effect. Okay, so from that search on typhoid, I then chose to look at the interview with Mrs. Omison. So you can see the interview transcript that's laid out on the web page, and that search term that I used is highlighted within the transcript, so I can see where that word actually appears in the data. And what's nice about QualiBank is that it also links to external resources. And you can see those circled at the top there. So if you click on those links, it will bring you to the bottom of the page after the transcript finishes. And you can see there's a variety of resources related to that particular interview available. And that includes an audio extract, a book extract, on the Edwardians. There's some images to help contextualize the data sets. And all of that added context, whether it's accompanying, audio or expanded discussion on the data from the original investigators or some other project which reuse the data, will really help to recontextualize the data. And this added context helps you understand the limitations and the opportunities within the data set. And again, QualiBank gives you direct access to some of those additional resources. Okay. Finally, there is the ability to cite using QualiBank. So we all know how important it is to appropriately cite your work. And this is no different when you're reusing data. So QualiBank automatically generates citations for you, which you can copy paste into your work. You simply click on the Create Citation button, which is in the left-hand menu. And then you highlight with your cursor a portion of the text that you want to cite. That Create Citation button will turn into a Retrieve Citation button. And then when you click on that, a small pop-up window like this is going to automatically appear. And that citation is very specific. It directs viewers to the specific passage that you've highlighted. So if someone is looking at the citation and they were to click on the persistent identifier, so that's the URL at the end of the citation, it would bring them specifically to the highlighted section of that transcript. So this addresses the third issue in reusing qualitative data, which is all about evidencing your conclusions. You don't just cite the general collection, or even just the transcript. You can actually get a much finer grain reference so others can see that quotation in the full context of the interview or the data set. So this really helps to add weight and transparency to your conclusions, and helps kind of reveal a bit more about your processes and your analysis. So QualiBank as a tool is something we're still developing at the archive. We're still working on things like support materials for it, expanding the data sets that are in it, and refining some of the features. If you do have any queries about it, please feel free to get in touch. Okay, what we're going to do now is have a bit of a break from me talking. We're going to do a quick activity where you get to go searching for some data with our data catalog. So there's going to be a worksheet that will hopefully appear for you in the chat. Let me see. Have you got it, Emma? Thank you, Emma, so much for that. So if you click on that, you'll come to a worksheet. I'm going to pause my screen for a moment so I can share this worksheet as well. Here it is. And I can see there are some questions here, so I will have a look at those. And I'm going to give you 10 minutes just have an explore. So the first part of this worksheet is just to find data. So just go to our data catalog, use the search bar to enter in some keywords that might be of interest to you. If you don't have a set topic of something that you're working on at the moment, we have given you some options there of some things that you might be interested in looking at maybe. Try and select some keywords from those topics and search for those. Make sure you're exploring both the Studies tab and the Reshare Studies tabs to see the full range of studies on your chosen topic. And then the second part of it is exploring how to browse the data. So once you've had a search result come back, try using the browsing facets on the left-hand side. For example, you might want to search just for qualitative and mixed methods data, or you might just want to search for data that's based in the UK or something like that. Or you could narrow your search to data sets that have been collected in the last 10 years. So explore some of the facets on the left-hand side. So I'm going to give you some time now, and I'll have a look at some of these questions. If you do have any issues or if you need some troubleshooting, please feel free to pop that into the webinar chat or into the Q&A. But I'll give you some time now with the data catalog. So you've had a few minutes. Hopefully, I don't see any queries about using the data catalog as such. So hopefully that's been a straightforward process. I'll leave that up. There's a couple of questions that came through. And before we go on, I'd just like I've written replies, but just to kind of note a couple of things that have come up. So someone's asked about how the data that we hold is different from what's available through the Office for National Statistics in the UK. And we do work with, other agencies like ONS, or some of you might be familiar with like Closer or ADR UK. And those agencies often will kind of specialize in a very specific type of data. They'll have a lot of data, but they'll specialize in like they offer statistics on national population surveys only, or longitudinal surveys only, or census data only, that sort of thing. Whereas we kind of, as long as it's data about people, we can take any kind of data. And we will also take it from a variety of sources. So where ONS will be using the data that they've collected through their own kind of mechanisms. We take data that is from, individual researchers, funded research projects, as well as government agencies and so on. So there is some overlap in the kind of data that that we make available and that ONS will use. If you are looking for things like some of the kind of finer grain survey data, so the potentially disclosive, like working with things like postcodes and that sort of thing, you may, depending on which survey you're looking at using, you'll either have to come to us and we'll get you set up with the Secure Lab, or ONS also have a platform called SRS that you would access it through. So there is some overlap in the kind of data we offer, but there's also a kind of distinction there. So hopefully that's clear. We had another question about the anonymization of the qualitative data. So the details of Mrs. Omison that you would have seen there, those are all pseudonymized. So I worked with one of my colleagues years ago, Lawrence, who spent a year anonymizing that particular collection because it was so large, and assigning pseudonyms throughout. So the data that we publish is always almost guaranteed to be pseudonymized. The only time we might make data available with real names in it is if there was explicit consent from participants. But even then, with qualitative data, that can be a tricky area. We are going to look at a collection. You have a download bundle kind of task in a bit where you get to look at an open collection, and that is where explicit consent to share the data had been gathered, and for it to be published with real names. Where there was just consent to share and there was no consent around it being unanonymized, that would have to go through a process of anonymization, and we would do some verification and checks before we publish it to make sure that it's robust and the possibility of re-identification was negligible enough to meet ICO's definition for effectively anonymous. And then there's one more question around accessing the data, which might come up as I get back into the slides. But basically, if you've tried to download the data and you were hit with a safeguard wall, If you're based at a UK university, of course, you can use your university login. If you're not based there, you can get one assigned. You can get a UK data service login assigned. So I will go over that in just a little bit, and you will have another worksheet coming up with a download bundle, so you can have a go at looking at what that download looks like. So I'm just going to switch my screen back to my slides. Here we go. If any more questions come up, please do feel free to keep those coming, and I'll try and get to them during the next break as well for your activities. Okay, so we do have a lot of new data that come in literally on a daily basis. So I know I've covered a few of the specific examples of some of our collections and some of the reuse projects, but I just wanted to put up some examples of some of our more recent acquisitions just to kind of show you the sorts of things that collections on things like climate change, as well as collections that are done with vulnerable and hard to reach populations like refugees and children. There's a lot of international collections coming in as well. So, research that's been conducted in Africa and Asia, for example. And these collections are always being updated as well. So, we get new collections every week, and most of those are available digitally. So, it's just kind of this growing part of our archive. So I'm just going to turn to the final sections of this presentation and just talk a little bit about access and some of the other tools and resources that will help get you started. So data are freely available to anyone who registers with us. Now, we do hold material under different licenses. So, for example, we hold open data, which is freely accessible to anyone. You can just download it straight from the catalog page. We also hold safeguarded data, which requires you to register before you are able to download the data. And then we also hold data under more restricted conditions. So any conditions for a data set will be listed on the catalog record, but basically, if you're using data for a non-commercial purpose, the data are going to be free to you once you register with us and tell us a little bit about your project. So you may also see some restrictions on qualitative collections, things like an embargo, which basically means that the data is not available until a specific date. Or you might see something like permission only access, which means that the archive will need to contact the depositor before we can release the data to you. Most of our collections, however, are the kind of standard safeguarded license. Data are typically held in multiple formats. So for qualitative data, that's going to be text. You'll most likely be getting some sort of word process document or maybe a PDF. We hold a few outputs of qual software packages, but we usually have asked the depositors to convert that into something a little bit more accessible, like a word process document, before we disseminate. We also hold images and audio and a little bit of video as well. We don't have huge collections of audio and video. There are some issues around data protection that we need to sort basically, but increasingly we do have offers of those, and we have the ability to take those as well where there's appropriate safeguards in place. So if you're at a UK university, you would use your own username and password to get you in. If you are not, you'll need to make an application to us, and assuming you meet the criteria and you agree to our terms and conditions, which I'm going to say a little bit about on the next slide, you'll then be issued a UK data service specific username and password, which will get you access to the data. Now, it's probably going to take me longer to read through this slide than to actually register. The only thing I'm going to point out is that when you do go through the registration, you accept the terms and conditions of the end user license. This is a legal document, and it's about as exciting as any legal document. But I want to stress 2 points from the document. If you sign up and use the data from the UK Data Service, you're promising that you won't disclose the identity of any of the participants, even if you should discover who they are. So in most cases, you'll not be able to uncover the identity of participants because the data have been anonymized and this has been checked. But if you should, you're not permitted to disclose that identity, and you should let us know so that we can change we can treat the data so that it's not disclosive to anyone else. The other thing you promise is that you won't share the data, and this means with anybody. So if you're working with a research team, or if you're a tutor who's working with students, anybody, you're not allowed to share the data onward. We do have a lot of resources available for students and researchers. They can always, register separately to access the data. But the idea is that if they want to see the data, they also have to sign our end user license, which makes the same promises for them. If you just share it with them, they haven't signed our end user license. So onward sharing is not allowed. And that also, I should say, that also means for your login as well. So if you have a login, you shouldn't just share your login with somebody else. So don't disclose the identities and don't share the data. Those are the two things to remember when you are ticking that little terms and conditions box of our end user license when you register with us. So downloading the data. Again, there's a great short video that walks you through the process, but you pick up your data. You have to, you'll find that in the left-hand menu, there's a few different options there. You might have to, this is a reshare collection, so you would access online. It'll bring you to another page where you will see the kind of zip files that you could download if you're signed in with your login and so on. When you do try to download it, it's going to, it may ask you to write a short description on what you plan to do with the data. So it is a little bit like online shopping. You kind of click to access it. You can add it to your account. You just tell us what you're going to do with the data, and then you'll be able to access the data from there. The video tutorials are really useful if you've not downloaded data with us before. Some data, it depends on the access restrictions of the data. So some data, it's a little bit more straightforward to download it than others. But if you do have any questions, feel free to get in touch with us or have a look for those tutorials. It's fairly straightforward once you've done it once or twice. But yeah, you would add it to your account, tell us what you're going to do with it, and then you can download it from there. Okay. I do want to do one more quick activity with you, which is about our open collection. So you can see basically just what a download bundle looks like. So in the chat, we're going to have another worksheet with some directions, and I'll swap my screen around as well so you can see it on the screen. And it's going to ask you to navigate to the Pioneers of Social Research collection and try to download the data directly from the catalog page. And then there's a few things to hunt for within that download bundle. So I'll give you some time to kind of look through and try and find some of those items. And then I'm going to share my screen and I'll kind of talk you through the download bundle a bit. Just so you can see like what the data looks like, what kind of documentation is available in there, and so on. So hopefully, thank you, Emma. Emma has popped that link in, and I'm just going to swap my screen around. Bear with me. Here we are. Okay, let me just try to scroll down a little bit. Okay, so if you click on the link that Emma has put up, you should be able to just click on the link there to get to the Pioneers of Social Research. And you'll see on the left-hand side, you have the Access study data, and this you can download directly. It's an open collection. These are interviews that are done with very eminent scholars. There was no point in even trying to anonymize it. You can't anonymize someone who is, at least within their area of study, is very well known. You know, if you were to see a life history of Stan Cohen, I think everybody knows Stan Cohen's work well enough to kind of be able to identify him. So, there was explicit consent from the participants to be able to publish their life histories as part of this collection. So if you click on that RTF button, you should get a zipped file download, and you can have a look through and see if you can find a few things in there. So you're looking for the data listing, the interview guide. You're going to look for Stan Cohen's interview transcript, which you can find the file name in the data listing for that. And then I've also asked you to open up the README file, the read 6226 file, where it gives you a little bit of information about the digitization of this collection. So I'll leave that with you for a few minutes, and I'll just give you a little whirlwind tour of the download bundle when we return in a bit. So as you're having an explore of that download bundle, there's been a couple more questions that come through. So someone's asked about the anonymization strategy. I mean, we anonymize a lot more than just the names. So any direct identifiers, which could be names or contact details, would automatically get some sort of pseudonym or redacted. Um, and then typically we will also anonymize dates. So we aggregate those to a higher level. So rather than a specific date, you might have the month and year or just the year, and place as well. So it depends on the context of the study. Um, but we may ask for places to be aggregated to a higher level, like region. Where a place is really important to the study and they're not able to change those places easily without affecting the integrity of the data, we then ask, well, what other characteristics might you anonymize that would help kind of hide the identities? We do a online workshop on anonymization. So I just hosted it last week, so it'll be held next um, in the kind of spring term. So have a look if you're interested in anonymization, do have a look at that. But I'm aware that, qualitative data holds particular challenges for anonymization because of the indirect identifiers. So, when someone tells their life story, there's so many details in there that could potentially be disclosive even when they're not their specific name. So there are particular challenges to effectively anonymizing qualitative data. Um, but we do have some strategies that we use. And then we also ensure that participants had a clear kind of consent procedure, as well as consider what kind of access restrictions might be needed. Um, so we do try and balance those. We've also had a question about international data for qualitative data. We do hold some international data. Admittedly, most of our collection is going to be based from the UK. So we are based in the UK, and a lot of the researchers who give us data are based in the UK. But I have seen data sets come in from different parts of Africa, from different parts of Asia. I don't see North America as much. I have seen a few things, but not as much, just because they do have data archives within the US. So ICPSR, for example, does take in qualitative data. And there's a couple of universities in Canada that also offer data archiving for qualitative data. So we don't see as much from there necessarily, but Europe is kind of at the forefront of the kind of data sharing landscape, if you will. So we're possibly a little bit ahead of our time in a sense. But yeah, we do take in other data, but you will find there's a little bit less of that. And then there was one more question around sharing of the quotations in publications. Absolutely, that's a type of data sharing. You are right there. But of course, if there's a quotation that's relevant for your publication, you can use that. What I would say though is, like, if you're looking to publish something and the publisher says, as part of the peer review process, we have to see the data, and that's increasingly common. There are kind of guidelines that publishers are using, which link into this kind of open science agenda. But if they do want to see the data, you'll just have to set signposts to the data set and say it's held here. Your peer reviewers will have to download it for themselves. So you can't share the data files, but extracts, of course, you'd be able to reuse those. Um, and I think I just saw one more thing pop up about the thematic highlights. Oh no, that was part of the data sharing when you're doing thematic analysis. Yeah, that is okay. Okay. I'm just going to switch back. And Give me just a moment. Hopefully you've been able to have a good explore of the download bundle. What I wanted to do now really quick was just talk you through a little bit of a tour of the download bundle. So hopefully, there we are. Hopefully you can see my file explorer now. So when you first go into the download bundle, you'll notice that there's an RTF and an MR doc folder. I just wanted to say that the MR doc folder is always going to be your documentation. So if we go into here, and it's always called the MR doc folder, not entirely sure where MR doc comes from. I know what some of the other folders that we use, why we use those. I'm not sure about, I assume doc is for documentation, but you'll notice that we divide things up often by the file format. So if you go into PDF, you'll see everything there is a PDF, and you might see some of these things like the U list, the user list, replicated in another format as well. So for our archiving standards, we try to use file formats that are non-proprietary. PDF is a great example of that. Things like Excel are sometimes easier to navigate and use, but there are sometimes difficulties if you don't have, for example, Office or something like that in opening those. So we will always try and keep things available as some kind of non-proprietary format. So we have an Excel version, but then we also have a number of documentation available under the PDF folder too. If we navigate into this other folder called the RTF. RTF is for rich text format. This is a non-proprietary form of a word processing document. You see we have interview summaries, we have interview transcripts, and then we have everything available as a PDF as well. So all of these are summaries that relate to each of the interview transcripts. And then because I've shared my file explorer, I don't think I don't think you'll be able to see if I open up but the user list you'll see gives you a kind of at a glance view of all of those different interview transcripts and summaries based on participant information. So that user list is really useful. It gives you this at a glance look. If you go to the data catalog, you'll find that other collections also have this kind of data listing, this at a glance view, as well as what might be called a user guide or just these kind of separate documents, supporting documents, the interview guide or some biographies or a blank consent form, that sort of stuff all might be shared alongside the data. And all of that documentation just kind of helps to recontextualize or helps guide you through the data itself. Hopefully you've been able to have a look at that README file as well, which is really useful just because you'll see that this was digitized in different waves. And then there were further interviews that were added later in from the original study. So if you downloaded a previous version of it, you might not have as many interviews as is available now. So it's useful to check that README file to see what kind of changes have been done. So hopefully you've been able to have a bit of an opportunity to explore that download bundle a bit. I'm weary of time. So let me just hop back on the slide because there's just a couple more things that I wanted to address. And I know there's another question that's come up in the Q&A, so I'll have a look at that as well in just a moment. So we've covered the different examples of data we hold. I've talked a little bit about finding and accessing the data. But what about the process of actually analyzing the data? And I just wanted to make a point about some of the documents that you would have seen in the download bundle, which make up the documentation part of the collection. So we often focus on the data itself, and we sometimes lose sight of the importance of documentation that's available with the collection. So when you start out reusing the data, the first thing that you will need to do is orient yourself to the original research project. And I think the main point here is not to underestimate the amount of time it will take to get acquainted with the data set. There might be multiple levels of context to get through in order to really understand that data. And what I mean by that is that you might have more than just the data that was collected at the time of the interview or whatever kind of data collection they were doing. But you might also need to consider the metadata of the participant, the historical time period in which the data was collected, or where the data were collected. So really, the idea is that you need to understand the data set as a whole in order to really get at the root of what the data can convey. And the documentation provided with the data set will be a really useful starting point for that. It often contains more information about the methodology. So you might have an interview schedule or a call for participants, or sometimes there's segments from publications arising from the original study, or it might have funding applications. I've also seen some studies which have sections that are written up by the principal investigator about particular features of the data set. So, for example, Annette Lawson conducted a study in the 1980s on adultery, and given the sensitivity of the topic at the time, the sampling became a primary focus for her. So she ended up writing a 56-page document just on her sample. In my time working with qualitative datasets at the UK Data Service, I've also seen things like background contextual material that was taken from the area of research. So there might have been local council meeting minutes, government pamphlets, NHS pamphlets, letters from participants, and all of that will help paint a picture of what was going on around this study. And ideally, that would be included with the documentation. And the kind of documentation does vary a lot, but there's some examples of what you can expect to find. We have, if we've curated the collection internally, you'll see these are all collated into a single user guide. If the collection has gone through our self-deposit system, so the reshare studies, the research team or PI may have just included a folder of clearly labeled documents instead. So what's available depends entirely on what's available at the time of deposit. So what the research team were able to share or what they thought would be useful for understanding the data. So there's a lot of variation in terms of what you can get in your documentation. So here's an example of one of our user guides, just so you can see what they look like. It's a PDF document. It's held in that MRDoc folder in your download bundle, and you'll see that they're bookmarked. The bookmark is on the right-hand side there, so you can kind of easily navigate through that piece of documentation. And this is the other standard piece of documentation that we ask for all depositors to create, and that's the data list. This is the at-a-glance look at the participants. So usually the first column is some sort of pseudonym or participant ID, and then the following columns are characteristics which are useful in getting an idea of who the sample was. So if you're just looking to use part of the collection, not the whole collection, the data list can help you filter and find the data you want. So for example, April Galway did some research using the Millennium Memory Bank interviews that are held at the LSE archives, and she specifically wanted to find single mothers. Unfortunately, in her case, the collection wasn't so well documented, so she ended up creating this kind of documentation, which took a big part of her PhD research project to do that. But if it had been documented, she would have been able to use the data list to find who those single mothers were. And just to reinforce, the importance of documentation, always make sure that you check that first. That is something that is kind of openly available. You should be able to just download that part, even without logging in. And it's just really good to kind of get to grips with the study as a whole. Okay, so just a couple of useful tips before we end here, particularly for new users. So when you go to our landing page, our home page, you'll see that there in the upper right-hand corner, there's a kind of contact us. At the bottom, we also have some legal bits. There is also a link of advice for new users. So you'll see if you're a new user there's going to be a link for you near the contact us link. And that's going to take you to some guides that have been specifically set up for those who are coming to the service for the very first time. We've got all sorts of resources in there about how to find data with our data catalog, how to register and access the data, what kinds of data we hold. We've also got links to some of the training that we've offered in the past. There's more webinars on different types of data, including census data, microdata, longitudinal data. So if you're a quant or mixed methods researcher, do have a look at some of those. And then, of course, you can also get in touch with us and send a help desk request. You can also connect with us on social media. So do check out our YouTube channel. There's this recording of this is going to be posted there, but there's lots of other videos as well. Um, and further training on data management. So do check out that. You can sign up for our JISC mail as well. If you would like to get a kind of weekly summary of all of the new collections that we've gotten, you can hop onto JISC mail and subscribe to our newsletter, and you'll get all of the updates on the latest editions and new studies that we've published. And we also regularly run training events. So these run termly, and we are at the end of the term now. So some of these we've run this term already, but we will run them again next term. So do check back on those. There's more covered on like anonymization, which I know came up. If you're interested in depositing your data with Reshare, we usually have an event around that. There's lots of computation, social science drop-ins, and that sort of thing. And then if you're interested in accessing some of our controlled data, so this is potentially disclosive data, this is the stuff that would have like things like postcodes in it. We also do our Safer Researcher training, which is posted on our events page as well. So check back on that. We update it regularly, and we do run lots of other types of data management training. And just a few more resources. So I've gone through support and how-to guides, as well as events like the workshops. We also have advice for data management for those who are in the, early stages of their research or looking to upskill. If you're coordinating kind of large programs that involve multi-university collaborations, we're very happy to talk with you about your data management requirements, whether you're just, a single individual who's looking to deposit their collection, or if you're part of this kind of larger research group. We're also really eager to hear about what you're doing with our data. So if you've had a previous publication or if you've reused our data in teaching, please get in touch. We can help you publicize that. We can also possibly get you featured in one of our case studies. Our case studies look at people's experiences of reusing data and depositing data. And that includes both research and learning purposes. So we'd love to hear your story of reuse. And if you do have any further questions, please see our help pages and our FAQs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have found this useful. Please do feel free to send through any questions that you have in the Q&A box. I know we have just a couple of minutes now, but I'm happy if anyone's got any questions to have a look at those. But yeah, hopefully you've found this useful. You will be prompted with that evaluation survey. So if you don't mind filling that, taking a few minutes to fill that in, that would be really helpful for us. And we hope to see you at some of our future events. So if you're interested in more data management, please do check out our training sessions. Early next term, we're going to post a whole new set of training events. And we hope to see you at some of those. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, see you next time.